a civil engineer by trade, which unfortunately means I have an obsessive habit of checking measurements. It drives my friends crazy, but I can't help it. If a room feels too long or a hallway too narrow, my brain just starts crunching numbers. When I bought my house in Flagstaff, Arizona in the winter of 2021, I did the same thing I always do, checked the specs. Before I unpacked a single box, before I even thought about curtains or furniture, I had the tape measure out, walking from room to room, jotting down numbers, square footage, ceiling heights, wall lengths, the whole deal. And right away, something bothered me. The listing claimed the house was just over 1,900 square feet. My measurements came out closer to 1,860. Not a huge difference, about 40 feet, but enough to itch at the back of my mind. Houses can be tricky like that. Walls thicker than you think, crawl spaces, weird stair landings. But this one wasn't complicated. Just a 1970s single-story ranch with a half-finished basement. A box, really, a simple box. And yet, the math didn't add up. At first, I shrugged it off. Realtors are notorious for rounding numbers or copying from outdated tax records. But then I noticed something odd in the living room. The north wall had a big, built-in bookshelf, floor to ceiling. It wasn't unusual, but it stuck out about a foot farther than seemed natural. The proportions were just off. The whole space felt slightly crooked, like the house was holding its breath. I chalked it up to dated design choices from the 70s and tried to ignore it. But that missing square footage gnawed at me. One Sunday afternoon, when the house was quiet and the only sound was the hum of the furnace, I started sketching out a rough floor plan on graph paper. Room by room, wall by wall. And sure enough, when I measured the back hallway, the one directly behind the bookshelf, the numbers didn't line up. That corridor should have been 5 feet deeper than it actually was. Instead, it ended flush against the wall. That night, I pressed my palm to the paneling behind the shelf. Hollow. Not drywall hollow. Empty hollow. I told myself it was probably a utility chase, maybe old ductwork boxed in, but the space was too big, too deliberate. It kept eating at me. Finally, about a week later, I gave in. Curiosity overrode good judgment. I pulled the lowest shelf loose, crouched down, and studied the wall behind it. That's when I saw them. Faint seams, barely visible, like someone had cut a rectangle and plastered over it. I tapped along with my knuckles, and about waist high, I felt a spot with more give. The outline of a door, 2 feet wide, maybe 4 tall. It took me 3 full days before I had the nerve to pry it open. Friday night, around 11 p.m., I slid a flat bar into the seam and pushed. The panel gave with a groan and swung inward like a hidden door in a movie. My heart hammered in my throat. Behind it was a narrow windowless room, no furniture, no carpet, just bare drywall and a single dangling light fixture with the bulb half burned out. Wires ran exposed along the joists. The floor was spotless, no dust, no cobwebs, nothing. And on the ceiling, bolted into the wood, was a steel bracket, the kind used to mount cameras. That was the moment my skin went cold, not from ghosts, not from anything supernatural, but from the simple realization that someone had deliberately built this space to watch. The air carried a faint chemical smell, sharp like rubbing alcohol, too clean, unnaturally clean. I stepped in, every muscle tight, scanning the corners as though something might leap out. Nothing. Just the bracket, staring down at me like a blind eye. I killed the light, shut the hidden door, and shoved the bookshelf back into place. For the rest of that night, I sat in the living room staring at the wall, telling myself it must have been for renovations, maybe security monitoring, but no explanation sat right. Why hide it? Why seal it behind a fake wall if it was harmless? The paranoia got worse with every passing day. I called my realtor the next week, asked about the previous owners. She flipped through her notes and told me the house had belonged to a contractor, a quiet guy, lived there only 2 years before selling. No red flags, no obvious history, but people don't carve out secret rooms just to install a camera bracket. Then, one night around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound. At first it was so faint, I thought I'd dreamed it. A hinge creaking, a floorboard shifting. But then I realized it was coming from the hallway. I slipped out of bed, barefoot, clutching the heavy flashlight I keep on my nightstand. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the fridge. I stepped into the hall and froze. The bookshelf was cracked open, just an inch, maybe less. I didn't check. I didn't want to. I backed out the front door, heart pounding, and called the police from my driveway. 2 cruisers arrived. They swept the house top to bottom while I stood out in the cold, my breath fogging the night. When the officers came back out, their expressions were tight, unreadable. "No one inside," one of them said. "No signs of forced entry. No evidence of a break-in. Their advice? New locks, better security, maybe even move if I felt unsafe." One officer, after glancing at the wall, speculated it might have been used years ago for short-term rental surveillance. "We've seen it before," he muttered. The words made my stomach turn. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. By morning, I'd already made the decision. I was selling. It was humiliating, moving out after only 3 months, but it was easier than living under that shadow, in a house where I wasn't sure if I was ever truly alone. Even now, in every building I step into, I measure, I count walls, I trace floor plans in my head, because if the math doesn't line up, if there's space unaccounted for, I need to know why. And in the back of my mind, I can't shake the thought that somewhere, hidden behind drywall and flagstaff, there's still a secret room, a space built for watching, and someone, somewhere, might still be using it. I've never been good with people. Small talk feels like sandpaper, and handshakes always leave me wishing I'd stayed home. For most of my 20s, I worked remotely, tucked away behind screens and servers, buried in code and freelance contracts. Renting was just a necessary evil. Paper-thin walls, landlords who just need to check something, and roommates who thought dishes grew legs. So when I finally bought a place of my own, I thought the best part would be silence. It wasn't a dream home, not the kind you see in glossy brochures, but it was mine. A modest 2-bedroom ranch-style house in the quiet outskirts of Knoxville, Tennessee. Built in the 70s, recently renovated, the kind of place with fresh paint and that faint tang of sawdust still lingering in the air. The realtor called it a starter home. To me, it was an endpoint. After years of drifting, I was finally rooted. The first week was calm, in a way I hadn't experienced before. I unpacked slowly, set up my office, and fell into a new rhythm. Days were groceries, chores, and work. Nights were quiet walks, under tall oaks, where the street was lined mostly with retirees who waved in that soft, nosy neighbor kind of way. It was during one of those first nights, me dragging my trash bin back to the curb, that a woman across the street called out, "You must be the new guy again." I paused, my hand on the bin handle. Again. She smiled as though she'd told a little joke. "Yeah, we had a new guy there just a few months back. Didn't last long." I laughed it off. "Well, hopefully I stick around." The polite wave followed, the universal sign for conversation over, but her words clung to me like cobwebs. The next day, while mowing the patchy lawn, an older man in a faded ball cap walked by. He slowed, gave me the same almost rehearsed line. "Another new owner already, huh?" This time I pressed. "What do you mean, another?" I just closed. He shrugged like it wasn't worth more than a passing comment. There was that guy before you. Moved in back in May. Strange, nobody said he left. Then he tipped his cap and kept walking, as though he hadn't just cracked something open in my head. I knew my paperwork. I'd closed in August. The deed transfer was clean. The last owner was a property management company that flipped houses. No mention of a tenant. No in-between owners. But once the seed of doubt had been planted, it spread. That night, I went back through every folder the realtor left me. Closing statements, county stamps, title records, all standard, no mystery. Still, unease simmered. A week later, unease turned into something sharper. I'd been working late, updates running in the background, when I fell asleep at my desk. Around 2 a.m., I stumbled into the kitchen for water. That's when I noticed it. The back porch light glowing through the glass. I hadn't turned it on. The switch by the back door was one I'd never touched. I stood in the dark, staring at that glow, like it had no business being there. Eventually, I flipped it off and went back to bed, trying to dismiss the creeping paranoia. The following morning, I mentioned it casually to the same woman across the street. Her smile faded. "You sure you didn't just see him?" she asked quietly. My skin prickled. "Him who?" "The man before you. Tall, shaved head. He used to sit on that porch, late at night with the light on. Smoked a lot. Always nodded when I waved. Then one day, gone." I told her she must have been mistaken, but the look she gave me said she wasn't. I dug deeper. County property records, tax filings, anything I could access online. Every document told the same story. The house had transferred directly from the management company to me. No trace of a man with a shaved head. But the neighbors didn't stop. A few days later, while walking, I passed a couple gardening. The man leaned on his shovel and said, "Fix that fence already?" The other guy never bothered. I hadn't touched the fence. That night, I broke my own rule and went down the rabbit hole. I searched the address, the neighborhood, missing persons in Knoxville. On the third page of results, I found him. Aaron Pierce. Missing since June. The photo was grainy, probably cropped from some old social media profile, but it was enough. Tall, shaved head. The kind of man you could picture smoking quietly on a porch with the light on. The dates lined up. Gone in June. Me moving in August. The neighbors saying, a few months ago. Maybe he'd rented under the table. Maybe he'd skipped town. Maybe missing didn't mean what it sounded like. But then the noises started. My bedroom shared a wall with the hallway, and above that hallway was the attic crawl space. Just a hatch, nothing special. But at night, around 1 or 2 a.m., I started hearing it. Soft thumps. Too heavy for squirrels. Too deliberate for raccoons. Slow. Spaced out. Like footsteps trying to hide themselves. I told myself it was the house settling. Old beams, old pipes. But the rhythm was wrong. One Friday, after weeks of restless half-sleep, I sat upright in bed, listening. The same pattern of weight shifting above me, and then, through the curtains, the faint glow of the porch light again. I didn't sleep. By morning, my nerves were stretched thin. I decided I'd had enough of pretending. I pulled down the attic ladder, flashlight in hand, every muscle in my chest tight but ready. The beam cut through the rafters and froze. He was there, a man, tall, shoulders hunched, head shaved clean, standing in the far corner, angled toward me like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. For one terrible second, neither of us moved. We just stared, the silence swollen and electric. Then instinct tore me loose. I dropped the flashlight, spun, and bolted barefoot through the front door, lungs burning. Behind me, the attic ladder creaked, then slammed. Heavy footsteps pounded the hallway floorboards. A back door banged open. Footsteps scattered into the yard. My hands shook so violently I could barely dial. When the police came, I told them everything. They searched the attic, the yard, the fence line. Nothing. No trace. One officer finally said, "He probably bolted the second you saw him. Happens sometimes." But the way he looked at me said the rest. Don't stay here tonight. I didn't. Even now, weeks later, what keeps me awake isn't the chase or the slam of doors. It's the image burned into my skull. Him standing still in the flashlight beam. Not rushing me. Not surprised. Just waiting. Like the house had been his all along. I bought my first real home in Flagstaff, Arizona, in February of 2023, right after the holiday market slump. I'd been saving for years, waiting for the right moment. As an architect, I thought I knew what I was getting into. I could take on a place that was a little rough around the edges, something with character, but not something so far gone it needed to be gutted. The house I ended up with was a single-story stucco ranch from the late 60s, tucked back on a quiet street lined with pine trees. Not perfect, but the kind of home that felt like it was waiting for someone to give it attention again. The moment I signed the papers, I pictured it as mine permanently. The first week was bliss, in the way only fresh starts can be. I painted walls, rearranged furniture, and unpacked slowly, stacking my books in messy piles until the shelves went up. At night, I'd sit on the hardwood floor, surrounded by takeout containers, and listen to the silence. No roommates, no landlords, no thin apartment walls with strangers on the other side, just me and the hum of the refrigerator. For the first time in years, I had something that belonged only to me. The first strange thing was small, almost forgettable. I was installing shelves in what would be the guest bedroom, marking studs, and tapping along the drywall, when I noticed something odd. The wall cavity felt wrong, too deep. Normally you can gauge thickness instinctively. 4 inches for drywall and studs, maybe 6 if it's old plaster. But when I knocked, it had a hollow drag, like the space behind it was much wider than it should have been. I chalked it up to quirky construction. Flagstaff is full of older homes that had been remodeled a dozen times, each owner cutting corners or making strange choices. Still, the sound stuck with me. By the second week, I started losing things. At first, it was subtle. A string cheese I swore I'd only eaten one of. A carton of eggs that seemed suspiciously light. A burrito I'd left on the middle shelf of the fridge was just gone. I told myself I was misremembering. Moving stress makes your head foggy, and I'd been exhausted from balancing my job sites with unpacking. But soon, I was double-checking before I left for work. I'd count pieces of fruit, line up leftovers, and when I came back at night, something would always be off. And then came the smell. It wasn't overwhelming, not at first, just faint traces of smoke. Not wood smoke from a fireplace, not incense. Tobacco. Old, stale tobacco. I don't smoke, and the realtor had proudly mentioned that the previous owner, a yoga instructor, had been fanatical about keeping the place pure and air-friendly. I walked through every room, pressing my nose into corners like a dog, but the smell would fade before I could pin it down. Just a ghost of smoke, then nothing. It escalated when I started tinkering. One Saturday, I decided to cut into the living room wall to create a recessed shelf. It should have been a simple project. Measure, score, check the studs, then frame it out. But the moment I cut a test hole, I froze. The wall wasn't 4 inches thick. It wasn't 6. The cavity was nearly a foot deep, and inside, caught in insulation, were scraps, a crumpled fast food wrapper, the torn end of a cigarette pack, ash, still clinging faintly, as if it hadn't been disturbed long. That wasn't a construction oddity. That was someone living inside my walls. I taped over the hole immediately. Then I just sat there in the living room, staring at it, waiting for something. I don't even know what. Maybe movement. maybe proof I wasn't losing my mind. That night, I needed evidence. Before leaving for work the next morning, I set my phone on the kitchen counter and left it recording. 6 hours later, I came back, locked the door, and replayed the footage. The first 3 hours were silence, then a faint creak, a muffled cough, buried under layers of insulation. At one point, the sound of a lighter flicking. I stopped the video and just sat there, staring at the dark screen. I called a contractor friend, told him I discovered a structural irregularity, and asked if he could come by to check it out with me. He showed up that Saturday, joking around at first, until we pulled a larger section of drywall from the guest bedroom. Behind it, wedged into the void, was a makeshift nest, thin blankets laid across insulation, empty wrappers, a battered duffel bag shoved into the corner. My friend recoiled like he'd touched something alive. "Call the cops. Now." The police didn't laugh. That was the worst part. They didn't even act surprised. They just moved through the house with grim efficiency, checking vents, closets, crawl spaces. Eventually, they found a narrow opening that led from the wall cavity up into the attic. Someone had been moving freely between spaces, slipping down while I was gone, maybe even when I was asleep. Inside the duffel bag were cigarette packs, food wrappers, and an old cracked phone with no SIM card. But the intruder was gone. The officers figured he'd slipped out the back while I was at work, maybe even while my friend and I were making calls. "It happens more than you'd think," one of them told me, almost apologetically. "Older homes like this, people find ways in. You're lucky you caught it." Lucky. That word didn't feel right. That night, I packed a bag and booked a hotel room. I sat there under sterile lights, every lamp on, staring at the blank walls, while the truth sank in. Someone had been inside my house with me, close enough to hear me brushing my teeth, close enough to smell my dinner, close enough to watch me sleep if they wanted to. The walls had held more than wiring and insulation. They had held someone who knew my routines, who had lived unseen, while I was busy telling myself I was finally safe. The house wasn't unsafe structurally, but for me, it was ruined. Every sound became loaded after that. Every creak, every draft. I didn't step foot back inside alone. 6 months later, I sold the place at a loss. Disclosure laws meant I had to explain the incident to buyers, which led to awkward silences during walkthroughs. Eventually, someone bought it as a rental, probably thinking the story made it more interesting, but not me. Now, every place I live, I measure the walls. I check crawl spaces. I sniff vents, like a bloodhound before I sleep. Because once you've heard a stranger cough inside your walls, you never stop listening for it again. I moved into my first real place in the summer of 2022, a narrow brick townhouse on the outskirts of Cincinnati. It wasn't perfect. The kitchen needed work. The upstairs floor tilted slightly, but it was mine. I ran a small web design business, mostly working overnight. When the neighborhood slept, I was awake, typing under the blue glow of my laptop. The first thing I bought for myself wasn't furniture. It was a doorbell camera. My mom teased me for it, but living alone in an unfamiliar area, it felt like a safety net. Every night, before shutting things down, I'd scroll through the motion alerts. It was like keeping a quiet diary of my street. Most nights, it was nothing more than cats, raccoons, or leaves tripping the sensor. Until one Tuesday morning, at exactly 3:14 a.m., a man appeared on the feed. He walked into frame, straight up the front path, and stopped at my door. He didn't knock, didn't try the handle. He just looked directly into the camera lens. For 30 seconds, he stood there, breathing, staring. Then he turned and walked away. I replayed it, trying to tell myself he was drunk, confused, maybe lost. But his movements weren't sloppy. They were steady, Intentional. 2 nights later, Thursday morning, 3:15. There he was again. Same pace, same stare, same silence. By the third time, Saturday morning, I knew it wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern. I saved the clips, zoomed in, studied him, mid-40s, medium build, plain clothes, no logos, no markings, no bag, just him. What unnerved me wasn't what he did, it was what he didn't do. He never spoke, never knocked, never tried the door. He just came to look. Every other night, always just after 3 a.m., I started staying up for it, setting alarms, watching the live feed as the clock ticked past 3. And the first night I watched him live, I realized how much worse it felt in real time. At 3:14, he appeared, walked up to the porch, lifted his chin, and locked eyes with the camera. It felt mutual, like we were both keeping some unspoken appointment. I called the police, sent the clips. They filed a report, promised to have patrol cars swing through, but nothing changed. The man kept coming. Never early, never late, every other night. And then, on the 12th visit, he changed. Same time, same approach. But this time, when he reached the porch, he smiled. Not a warm smile, not friendly, just a small, deliberate curl of the mouth, as if to say, "I know you're watching this time." That was worse than all the silence. I dialed 911 while he stood there, still smiling. By the time the cruiser arrived, he was gone. The officer searched. Nothing. The camera caught him leaving frame, same as always. And then, just like that, it stopped. No more 3 a.m. visits. A week passed. Then 2. Then 3. The police never found him. My neighbors never saw him. It was like he appeared only for me. But here's what unsettles me most. People don't build rituals like that just to quit. Rituals transfer. To this day, I still check the feed at 3:14 some nights, just in case. Because I never figured out how he did it. How he was always so precise. Never early, never late. Always vanishing the same way. And I never figured out why he stopped. For that one smile, that tiny deliberate break in routine, it didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like a promise.